A former Washington State Senator and a lifelong organizer for immigrant, civil, and human rights, Representative Pramila Jayapal is currently serving her fourth term in Congress for Seattle and the surrounding communities. In 2016, she became the first South Asian American woman ever elected to the House. She came to the United States alone at the age of 16 and went on to start the largest immigrant rights organization in Washington State before becoming one of 24 naturalized citizens serving in Congress today. As the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Representative Jayapal is the lead sponsor of the Medicare for All Act, the College for All Act, the Housing is a Human Right Act, the Ultra Millionaire Tax Act, and the Roadmap to Freedom Immigration Resolution. She currently serves on the Judiciary, where she is also ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee and Education and Workforce Committee. Congresswoman Jayapal lives in Seattle with her husband, Steve, who is also in attendance with us. Welcome, Congresswoman. It's an honor. And I'm going to go off script now and say that I did meet Congresswoman Jayapal in 2023 when she came out to Wisconsin to work on several campaigns that some community social movement organizations were on. And I look forward to hearing your talk.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Armando. And thank you all very much for being here. I'm very grateful to the Wright Center for Social Justice for having me here and looking forward to the conversation. I don't know that I'll be 50 minutes in my lecture. I think I'd rather have a conversation, but I get carried away sometimes. So you never know, it might happen. You have some terrific progressive electeds in Wisconsin, and I know you have a proud history with the progressive movement. And so I take my hat off to you for that. And I think that for me, it's what I want to talk about is very much rooted in being an organizer. You heard a little bit about that from Armando. I never thought I was going to be in elected office. I had really no interest whatsoever in running for office. As Armando said, I came to the United States when I was 16 years old by myself. My parents had about $5,000 in their bank account. They used it all to send me here because they believed that this was the place that I was going to have the most opportunity and the best education. And it took me 17 years to become a U.S. citizen. And by the time I did, and by the time I could sponsor them, it was really too late for them to move at that age. And so I have never lived on the same continent as my parents since I came here, since the age of 16. Now, those of you who know immigrant parents, or perhaps are immigrant parents, you know that there are 3 professions that your child is allowed to be if you're going to take all your money and send them across the ocean, and know that they might never come back. And I bet you can guess what they are. Doctor, say it with me, lawyer, or an engineer. Yeah, everyone always knows. And so those were the 3 professions I was supposed to be. I went to Georgetown University and we didn't have any money. So I was able to, and this was I'm going to date myself here. This was pre-Skype, all of those technologies. So I got one phone call home a year, and I used my phone call from the hall, from the dorm phone that was in the hallway, to call my father in India and tell him that I was going to be an English literature major instead of an economics major. And then I had to hold the phone away from my ear like this as he screamed at me and said, "I didn't send you to the United States to learn how to speak English. You already know how to speak English." And so my promise to him was that I would still go off and get an economics minor and do with that degree, that English literature degree, the same thing that I would have done with an economics degree. And so I did that. I worked on Wall Street. I got a master's in business at the Kellogg School of Management in Chicago. And I realized through all of those experiences that I didn't want to be in the private sector, that I wanted to do something that actually made a difference, that I felt was contributing to the world and that was paying it forward in terms of the opportunity that I had been given. And so that started my public path. And I spent 2 decades as an organizer, as Armando said, for women's rights, immigrant rights, economic justice, social justice, internationally and domestically. So I worked all over the world first, actually, for about 8 years. I lived in villages all over India. My first book it's called India Woman Revisits Her Homeland. That was about 2 years that I spent living in villages all over my birth country, which I had never done. I had mostly lived with my parents when I was there, and so it was a completely new experience. And then I came back to the United States, and 9/11 happened. I ended up starting and leading for 12 years what is the largest immigrant advocacy organization in Washington State, one of the largest in the country, working to build a movement for justice with unions, with with a very broad and diverse coalition of people. And so doing that, we were able to do incredible things. I've been arrested several times for civil disobedience protests. We used every strategy in the toolbox to try and move policy forward. And I'm really proud to say that we were able to do that on such important policies. Washington State has some of the best policies for immigrant rights, really due to the work that we did. Everything from preserving driver's licenses. We were one of very few states that did that for undocumented people, but also on economic policy. So I was on the committee that worked to make Seattle the first major city in the country to pass a $15 minimum wage. And so that was almost 12 years ago now, if you can imagine that. We're still talking about raising the federal minimum wage, but in Seattle, we were able to pass that almost 15 years ago. We also worked on passing DACA. I was part of the movement with undocumented students that urged Obama to pass DACA. And it was, I think, an incredible education in what it means to organize on the ground and also what we need to do. And I think that during all of that work, I realized something that surprised me. I had always been very skeptical of elected officials. I really thought that most of them were not necessarily doing things that, with some exceptions, but not necessarily doing things that represented me, that I didn't see myself represented, but I also didn't see our lived experiences of our communities represented in a lot of elected officials. And there were very few women of color organizers, very, very few in elected office that I could use as role models. But as I worked on trying to change policy from the outside, I realized that I was thinking about it all wrong. That really what I should be thinking about was how you use elected office as an organizing platform. And what could you do if you got more organizers, more people with lived experiences, more diversity into elected office? And how could we build power on the inside that could work with the power and the coalitions we were building on the outside to achieve the kinds of policies that we were all fighting for and that were good for people? And so in 2014, I tested that theory of change. I ran for the Washington State Senate. I became the first South Asian American woman elected to the state legislature. I was the only woman of color in the state Senate, which is kind of a remarkable thing when you think about Washington State. And I was there for 2 years. I'm very proud to say that because of the work that I did, and because when we run and we're represented with our beautiful diversity, it's not only that policy is better, but we actually change the way people think about their own futures. And so now, after I've run, we've had 5 South Asian American women elected to the state legislature. We have a lot of women of color and many more women of color in the state legislature. And that's been a very conscious effort to make sure that we are bringing more people in with us. 2 years after getting elected to state Senate, I ran for Congress and I was elected in 2016. That was the same night that Kamala Harris was elected as well. I became the first South Asian American woman elected to the House She became the first South Asian American woman and the second Black woman elected to the Senate. And by the way, at the time, I was one of only 3 or 4 members of Congress who refused to take corporate PAC money when I ran. We had a very competitive primary because we have a top 2 primary in Washington state. So I was actually running against a very well funded Democratic, a good Democratic opponent. And so it was the most expensive non swing district race in the country. But I said I was not going to take any corporate PAC money, that we were going to be fueled by small contributions, which was all part of saying, how do you make sure that people, when they're elected to office, are working for the people and not for the special interests that fund too many campaigns? Today, by the way, we've made some progress on that. There are about 67 members of Congress who don't take corporate PAC money. So we are moving in the right direction if we're not all there. But back to 2016, it was sadly also the night that Donald Trump was elected. And I remember it like it was yesterday. We had to get to work immediately. We had the Muslim ban. I had been nervous about being an elected official because I wasn't really sure what that entailed. And I realized as I was heading to the airport to stop a plane from leaving, we literally had to bring it back as it was on the tarmac to stop deporting Muslims who were targeted by Trump's Muslim ban. And I helped organize a huge group of people who came to the airport, and I had a bullhorn, and I was threatening to shut down the airport if we didn't stop that plane from leaving. I thought, oh, this is just like organizing. It's just now I have a title that actually helps make people listen. But as a result of all of that and what happened, the first bill that I introduced was a bill that I introduced with then Senator Kamala Harris. And it was the Access to Legal Counsel bill. It provided legal access to people who were in that situation of facing deportation because of Trump's Muslim ban. Everything that happened after Donald Trump was elected proved to me again how important it was that we organize on the inside. And I'm proud that despite the title I have, I've never stopped being an organizer. It is the single thing that drives me in terms of what I want to do and how I want to interact, whether it was showing up at the airports in that circumstance or whether it was organizing with incredible members of Congress like the late, great John Lewis, in the streets fighting for immigration reform or walking across the bridge in Selma, pushing for expanded voting rights. And even today, I feel like I think like an organizer all the time. What coalitions do we need to build? What strategies should we use? And how do we coordinate on the inside and the outside for maximum power and leverage? So I want to spend a minute just talking about power, because I think power is often a dirty word in the progressive movement. And and I want to just offer that my perspective on the progressive path forward depends actually on us having and leveraging power. And so really understanding what power is and how it's utilized is very important, because power has been used in history so often, politically and economically, to quash the people, that I think some progressives are uncomfortable with the idea of power. But it misses the point of why power is actually important, because we actually need it and we need to wield it so that it can make a difference. Instead of power being used against us, we have to wield it so it's used for the people. And without power, I don't believe that we can actually move the moral arc of the universe towards justice. So we need power. We just have to be careful about making it people's power, collective power, rather than individual power. And so that means that we need a progressive infrastructure that can build, grow, leverage, and wield that power. And organizing is key to that because it's the democratization of power building. Organizing is actually what allows us to grow a movement that is committed to the same values and goals. And it's really hard work for those of you that have organized and that have studied organizing movements. It's actually not just big rallies and protests. They can be important strategies at different times, but it's actually training, it's education, it's coherent strategy, it's a complex understanding of all the dynamics that are at play that lead you to think about what, how, when we can win things that we're pushing for. And it actually requires that real structure behind it to sort of empower all of that movement building. It is about governing, because I think a lot of people think that progressives don't know how to govern and that we want everything, which is true. I don't mind saying I want everything. I want it all. I want it tomorrow. That's absolutely true. And it is true that governing means understanding the difference between compromise and principled compromise. Those are two very different things. So when people say you should just compromise, usually what they're saying is split the difference. And the extreme example I might give is if you wanted to deport 1,000 people and I wanted to deport zero, then we compromise and we just deport 500, right? That's not a principled compromise. So, what is a principled compromise is actually thinking about how you can get the most that you can possibly achieve, which is a judgment call, but how you can get the most you can possibly achieve and move some people forward as long as you are not moving other people back. So you may not get everything, but how do you move the most people forward without moving anyone back? And to me, that's a lot of what I have to think about, even if it sometimes makes me uncomfortable because I want more. But the circumstances, the structures may not be there for us to get it. But that's what I call principled governing. So, how do we fight for a progressive path forward? First, I want to talk about how we built progressive power, and I'll give you the example of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, but obviously, this applies to the progressive movement at large and what that has meant for millions of poor and working people across the country. Second, I want to be clear eyed about the barriers that face us, the stakes of the moment, and the challenges that are in front of us. And then third, I want to talk about what it's going to take to win right now and deliver transformative change. And then we'll just open it up for a discussion. So, building progressive power. When I first got to Congress in 2017, I found two things. First, that people like me were largely unrepresented in race, gender, and class. Second, that there was really no infrastructure built within Congress, within elected office, to support organizing efforts. And I'll just tell you the little story for those of you who know the history of the progressive movement. The Progressive Caucus in Congress was started in 1991 by a dear friend of mine, somebody who I've supported for president both times he ran. It was Bernie Sanders and Maxine Waters. And Bernie will say to me that it was a place where, a dozen or 2 dozen people went to complain. I mean, he'll say that, he'll say it with a laugh, but he'll say it. And it was a pretty small group of people. And, I don't think it was really intended to build and leverage power per se. And so if we wanted to have and leverage power, we needed more people who understood what that would take and more structure to make it happen. And thanks to some amazing people that came before me, people like Barbara Lee, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who was one of the only people that I saw that was made me want to go into elected office. She was actually the first person I reached out to when I decided to run for Congress. She and Stacey Abrams, who was also a dear friend and was pushing me to run for a long time. But Barbara Lee, Keith Ellison, and yes, my good friend, UW-Madison's own Congress member, Mark Pocan. These were all people who were trying to turn the Progressive Caucus into an organized force. And so we had some good stuff to build on. But we needed to build the CPC into a force that represented a significant number of votes. And we can talk about this later if you want in the discussion. But you can sometimes win a vote with 4 votes blocking. But it's a hell of a lot better if you can win with 60 votes blocking, particularly if it's on an issue that is capturing the nation's attention. Because the narrative that surrounds a 60 vote win is very, very different than a 4 vote win. And it allows for a whole set of different things to happen. So I'll give you an example of this. We wanted to build a significant voting block that could leverage our votes for specific pieces of legislation that we were fighting for. We also, by the way, needed a lot better infrastructure to support our CPC members. We had one staff person when I came in who was supposed to support several dozen members of Congress and the CPC. And we're progressives. We hadn't raised the dues for membership, which is what pays for staff in a couple of decades. So we realized we needed infrastructure to support our work because part of what we needed to do is educate our members regularly about the myriad of issues that were coming before us and counter the hundreds of lobbyists that are outside our door every single day, spreading all kinds of information that scares members if they don't know otherwise. And we also needed to be able to organize collectively as a body in key moments. And so we did make a lot of changes to the structure. And today, the CPC is almost 100 members strong. It's far more powerful and more diverse than it ever has been. It represents all of the members of all of the ethnic caucuses. So we call them the ethnic caucuses, but it's the Hispanic caucus, the Black caucus, and the Asian American caucus. We also have members of the LGBTQ caucus, where I'm also the co-chair of the Transgender Equality Task Force. But we now had multiple staff and a structure that could actually support our members. We also, this was a little controversial, but we managed to get it through with a 90% vote, going back to, could have gotten it through with 51, but I wanted 90 because I wanted there to be no argument about where we were headed. We instilled new rules for membership, including requirements to, if you want to be a member of the Progressive Caucus, you had to sign on to certain flagship, what we call flagship progressive bills. That was things like Medicare for All, a Green New Deal, the PRO Act, the Raise the Wage Act, things that were part and parcel of how we see the world and how we define the world. We also had strict attendance requirements, which really annoyed members of Congress, but it was important because those weekly meetings were where we were doing the education about the issues that were in front of us. They turned out to be, we have incredible attendance now at our meetings because people are getting something of real value there. They're learning something about the issues that they care about as we counter all the big lobbyists. We also instituted what we call a block voting process. It's a little imperfect. It still needs to be perfected, but it allowed us to take positions on big pieces of legislation with a 2/3 majority vote. And then if we took a position on a piece of legislation, then our members would have to vote with us 70% of the time. So it sort of was pushing towards what is the collective power that we are building with our votes. Separately, we juiced up our outside work with what's called the Congressional Progressive Caucus PAC. This is the entity that helps elect new members, new progressive members across the country and defends our incumbent members. We went from having just $300,000 per cycle to now having over $4 million per cycle. We stopped taking corporate PAC money. Actually, the Congressional Progressive Caucus PAC used to take corporate PAC money. We stopped doing that. And we actually were able to grow it because we had all these people who wanted to help us elect incredible progressives. And so that is funding that we've used to fight off challenges and to support some of our new awesome progressives, from Maxwell Frost, who's our first Gen Z member from Florida, to Ilhan Omar, Summer Lee, Chris Deluzio, Delio Ramirez, and many, many more who faced incredibly tough races and needed money and organizing to help win. And we haven't won every fight. You've seen we've lost a couple of big fights recently with a couple of important progressive members, but we are protecting and building. And part of, I'm going to talk about this in a second, part of the resistance has been we've been successful. And the CPC is more diverse than ever and has more organizers inside than ever before. We also helped build an outside organization called the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, which is a 501c3 and 501c4 that can coordinate progressive think tanks, research, and really put forward ideas that we should be pushing and help us to analyze legislation when it comes out. It gives us trusty, immediate research that we can rely on. Equally important, we built a deep relationship with our outside movement allies. These are folks like Move On and Indivisible, our unions, immigrant rights groups, on legislative strategy and tactics. And this really requires trust because it's a sharing of information that you may not necessarily want to put out there, broadly, but you do want to make sure that key leaders are on the same page about what's happening in negotiations. And so that was also very important because it was the space where we were able to build agreement around what we were fighting for, which was critically important to keeping everyone together. The best example of how this really worked and played out to the benefit of people was in the campaign, sort of the stretch of things that happened. The campaign to elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, in the definition of the agenda that they ran on, and then in the negotiations to achieve that agenda. So, thanks to Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, some of the progressives who ran for president, we were able to get some progressive issues on the national table and elevate some of those issues in a way that allowed us to have more leverage when it came time to combine efforts to make sure that we had a unified progressive coalition that could win in 2020 and would turn out and help elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And so you may remember the Biden Sanders Unity Task Forces in the lead up to the 2020 election. I co chaired the healthcare one. All of that was the effort to put together a draft agenda for what we would do if we won. So we often run as an opposition party, right? We're better than the other guy. He's really bad or she's really bad. But we don't always run as a proposition party. What are we going to do if we win? What is it that we're calling people into and saying, this is what we're going to do if we win? And so this was our proposition agenda. But the important thing was it was crafted with the input of groups on the outside, progressive lawmakers, and the candidates themselves. And so that was a very different way than has ever happened before. But it was partly because the CPC was organized and we could, with our movement allies, come up with a progressive agenda and then push that both from the outside and the inside. And the Biden Harris administration, to their credit, to the campaign and then to the administration, really embraced a lot of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And they also understood that we were going to push for things that maybe they hadn't embraced, but we were still going to push for them. Some of them we got done, some of them we didn't. But it's why you saw President Biden and Vice President Harris roll out progressive legislation after progressive legislation when they got in. From the American Rescue Plan, which put checks in people's pockets, a child tax credit that cut childhood poverty in half, a comprehensive immigration reform bill that was the first bill actually that they introduced of that 4-year period, to the ambitious, very bold, very progressive Build Back Better agenda that had so much in it and included both infrastructure as well as childcare, universal childcare, housing, prescription drug pricing, a whole set of other progressive tax reform. And the CPC was absolutely key to all of those negotiations. We were tightly coordinated with the outside movement. We worked closely with the White House to get these big things done. And it doesn't mean that we won every fight. We didn't win every fight. There was a very crucial moment when the White House made the decision to split what was called the Build Back Better agenda into the infrastructure bill and then the Build Back Better legislation, which some people described as human infrastructure. But basically, it took the lowest hanging fruit of roads and bridges, and we made that much more than that. But it took that, put it into the infrastructure bill, and then it left everything else that was childcare, housing, prescription drug pricing, climate investments, et cetera, in another bill. That was a bad move, in my opinion. I told them that. We tried to stop that from happening, but it happened. So then we had to regroup and figure out, okay, now what do we do? How do we get both things passed? And at that point, we had a decision to make because the infrastructure bill came to us from the Senate with every Democratic senator voting for it. A lot of pressure on the House to pass that bill, president pushing for it. But the CPC, because we had been doing months of organizing, we had people ready, 60 plus people, members ready to withhold their votes. And without our votes, it was not going to pass. And so we held the line, not just once, not just twice, but 3 times over and over again. We held the line and we said, we need to see the Build Back Better legislation. What's the rest of this package? We want to negotiate that. And once we have that in writing, and once we pass that, then we will also pass the infrastructure bill in the House, which is exactly what happened, not without not without a lot of drama-filled weeks and months, a lot of phone calls from the president and the speaker, and a lot of people saying that progressives couldn't govern. But you know what also happened is it inspired the country to see that we were standing up for what they've believed in. And because of that, we were able to pass the infrastructure bill. And then a week later, we passed the Build Back Better bill through the House. That is ultimately what led to the Inflation Reduction Act. We still didn't get all of Build Back Better, but we did get the Inflation Reduction Act, the most significant investment in taking on climate change, a climate youth corps that will create 20,000 new jobs for young people to protect public lands. The first time that big pharma is going to be required to negotiate drug prices, capping insulin at $35, progressive taxation, not everything we wanted, but a lot of things. And I think that is also how we demanded the Justice 40 initiative. 40% of all federal investments should go into communities that have been disproportionately burdened by climate change, Black, brown, poor communities. And I was just in a really moving event in Georgia. I've been going all over the country for the presidential campaign. And it was all these folks, Black folks in the South, not just in Georgia, but in Texas and Louisiana, who were saying it's been a sea change because they're finally seeing federal dollars come into their communities because of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so we also use that same power, by the way, to demand in negotiations for the first time ever that in the CHIPS and Science Act, they needed our votes. And it was down to the wire. Again, the Senate had passed it and it came to the House. And I had negotiations with Secretary Raimondo to say, if we're going to put money into pushing for domestic manufacturing, that money cannot go to stock buybacks. These big corporations, they take the money and then they spend it on stock buybacks. And that cannot be the case. And so for the first time ever, we got that agreement. Now, implementing is an ongoing challenge. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh, it's all perfect. But these are the big steps. We've never had that in writing before. And we got that in writing. So we built power, right? We built power. But we didn't just build it to wield it like so many on Wall Street do. We built it to deliver for poor folks. We built it to deliver for working people, to protect our planet, to protect the vulnerable and the marginalized, and to combat unchecked corporate power. And we achieved incredible, incredible results. As I said, a couple things I didn't mention because I was just on the phone. There's a new announcement coming out tomorrow on this, but thanks to the Biden-Harris administration, we also pushed for a lot of executive actions, things that we couldn't do through legislation because we didn't have the Senate or the House, but that could be done through executive actions through the White House directly. And the cancellation of student debt was one I'm particularly proud of. So even though so much of it has been blocked in the courts, we have still, thanks to Biden and Harris, we've canceled student debt for 5 million people. That is 1 out of every 10 borrowers. And tomorrow there will be a proposed hardship rule that comes out that will cancel it again for another potentially 8 million people. So this is a huge thing that just a few years ago, everyone said, you're crazy. No, you can't cancel student debt. But thanks to the movement, we were really able to make that happen. We've also pardoned thousands of people charged for possessing marijuana. We also were able to get medical debt off credit records. This was a huge, huge deal. We increased funding for the NLRB to crack down on union busting corporations, and we increased funding for the IRS to crack down on tax cheats. That has brought in $1 billion just in 1 year. All these tax cheats that weren't paying their taxes, just by putting more money into enforcement, we were able to bring in all of that revenue just in 1 year. The Biden-Harris administration also invested in something very important, the antitrust division at DOJ, and also within the FTC with Lena Khan, and then also in the CFPB with Rohit Chopra. These are important because these are the entities that crack down on the monopolies that are taking over, giant mergers that are pushing small businesses out, that are price gouging, that are raising prices for regular people. We used to think about monopolies and antitrust in the context of railroads, and people are like, well, that doesn't really apply anymore. No, now it's thinking about how these big tech companies are actually pushing away the ability for independent newspapers to survive, or the price gouging that's happening, or the monopolies that happen when there's only one diaper company or baby formula company, or when you go to the grocery store and you see tons of detergents on the shelf, and then you turn them around, you realize they're owned by two companies. And by the way, why do they cost so much? Because they're just soap and water, right? And so this is all of the stuff that regular people are dealing with, that I think has been really, really important. So all of this taken together, I tell you this because I think it's important to think about this not just as individual pieces of legislation, but as a sea change in how we think about the economy and how we think about economic change in general, economic theory. So it's a sea change from the neoliberal trickle down economic theory days to something that is bottom up, middle out, lifting up working people and working people. Those are the investments that actually lead to economic growth. That's just turning everything on the head. And frankly, Democrats were a big part of that neoliberal economic thinking as well. And so to have somebody who was considered a moderate president, Joe Biden, to really promote what is a very populist, progressive, and accurate way of thinking about economic change, I think is really important. And it really is about saying we all do better when we all do better. So these are huge collective victories. Now, what happens when we're successful? We have huge backlash. People don't want us to be successful. That is, when you're getting backlash, when you're getting pushback, it's because you've been successful. So are we getting that now? Absolutely. We are getting that now. We are seeing attacks on progressives. We're seeing attacks on the word progressive. We're seeing progressives being pushed out of office. Yes, those attacks are happening. And I like to think of it as a sign of our success, because if we weren't successful, people would just ignore us, right? But because we're successful, there are attacks. And so I think it's important for us to see that as a sign of our power, a sign of our being powerful, and to see it as the next iteration, the next stage of our fight. I want to be clear, the things that we are trying to change are not easy, and they don't happen overnight because we're pushing against very entrenched interests. We're pushing against a lot of money in politics. And whether it's around domestic economic policy or whether it's around foreign policy, like US policy in the Middle East, it is very difficult to change. And so some of you know that I've been one of the earliest and one of the most vocal members of Congress in denouncing Hamas's brutal attack on October 7th and immediately calling for a ceasefire, because I think that was the only way that we could actually get the hostages home, bring peace and security to both Palestinians and Israelis. And I've also been calling for a change in U.S. policy towards towards Israel in terms of we should stop funding offensive military weapons that are being used to kill Palestinians and now to kill folks in Lebanon. Um, that, along with everything that we're fighting for on the economic front, these are tough. These are really tough. They're complex. They don't happen overnight. They are painful because it seems so clear sometimes, whatever the issue is, whether it's housing, whether it's the Middle East, what we should do. But I think the important thing for us to remember is that these kinds of issues take a long time, not a long time, but they take time to make change. And so we can't give up, because if we give up, we actually know what the outcome would be. We know what the outcome would be. And so we can win against very steep odds, as we have done over and over again, with all these things that people said weren't possible 5 years ago. It's not as quick as we want, it's painful, but it is our resilience and our refusal to not back down that has really won every single fight in our history, whether you're talking about ending slavery or getting the right to vote or the things that we just won. So as we think about our proposition agenda, the CPC has already put out a day one agenda for the next term. It's been endorsed by all of our progressive allies. And it's really our vision, our proposition agenda of what we will do House and the Senate back. And I like to say that we have to think about this not just in terms of changing rulers, right? I think about electing new progressives into office as being changing rulers, right? People that are in office, but also about changing, thank you, also about changing the rules. And this is really important because so much of the barriers that we face are about the rules that were predetermined, the structures that were put in place long before we ever came into the picture to benefit certain interests. And so this starts with addressing some of the deepest structural barriers that stop us from making progress. And one of the key ones, not the only one, but one of the key ones to passing any of this legislation is the filibuster. Getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate. The filibuster is a Jim Crow legacy rule that was used to stop incredibly important civil rights legislation from being passed. And it requires a 60 vote threshold to not just pass, but even to debate legislation that goes to the Senate floor. So that means that even when Democrats control all three chambers, if you will, the White House, the House, and the Senate, and we want to pass popular legislation like gun reform or immigration reform or voting rights or getting money out of politics, these are things that 70%, upwards of 70% of Americans support. So that's Republicans, independents, and Democrats. We can't get it through. And we in the House pass all of it. And then we send it to the place that I call the place where all good things go to die, the United States Senate. And in the United States Senate, 40 largely white men who represent 12% of the country's population get to block all of that stuff from happening. The filibuster has to go. Either has to be suspended for specific votes or it has to be eliminated if we actually want to try and get any of these things done. Otherwise, we're going to have the situation where we promise things to people across the country and then we say, well, sorry, we couldn't get it done. So that is really important if we want to codify abortion rights, if we want to expand voting rights, if we want to get DC statehood, get money out of politics, pass immigration reform. These are all top issues that contribute to the structural integrity of our democracy. Now, there's a lot more in our day one agenda, and you can go on our website, our CPC Progressive Caucus website to get all of it. But it's universal childcare where no family pays more than 7%. It's big investments in housing because the rent is too damn high and no one can afford to buy a house. It's taxing billionaires and corporations to pay their fair share. It's expanding Social Security and Medicare. We need to make sure that we actually include dental, vision, and hearing, that we reduce the Medicare eligibility age on our way to Medicare for all. We need to raise the minimum wage to a livable wage because I think we're way past 15. We need to pass the PRO Act and other major reforms to bargaining, like sectoral bargaining, so that unions and workers can actually bargain fair contracts and get strength and power across the country. So I hope you take a look at that agenda. But none of it happens unless we win in November. And so that brings me to right now. We have 11 days until this next election. And the choice has never been clearer. It's why I have been in every swing state across the country. I'm here until Saturday, then I'm in Michigan. Last weekend, I was in Pennsylvania. The weekend before, I was in Michigan. My husband knows because he's been coming with me. The weekend before, I was in Georgia. I've been in Georgia actually a couple of times. And the choice just hasn't been clearer. We have a rambling, incoherent, convicted felon who fueled an insurrection on January 6th and has said that he wants to be dictator on day one. And Donald Trump's Project 2025 lays it all out for us. We don't have to imagine what's going to happen. It's all laid out in a 900 plus page document that tells us how he wants to do a total takeover of our government, of our individual rights and freedoms, and destroy our democracy. He wants to fire tens of thousands of civil servants. so that he can replace them with his own political cronies. He wants to get rid of the independence of the Department of Justice so that the Department of Justice will do whatever he wants, including imprisoning his political opponents. He wants to ban not just abortion, but IVF and contraception as well. He wants to eliminate birthright citizenship, build military detention camps to imprison asylum seekers, engage in mass deportations, systemically remove all LGBTQ protections, and there's more and more. And we know, as Attorney General James in New York showed us, that he is a billionaire who will lie and cheat and steal to enrich himself at the expense of others. And that's only going to be magnified when he's in power. I was in the gallery on January 6th. I was trapped there, one of 36 members of Congress who was trapped in the gallery because it was COVID, and only a few members of Congress were on the floor, and then a few of us were up in the gallery, and everyone else was in their offices. And I remember that day so vividly. I was on the floor. In fact, some of the earliest footage from MSNBC was of me because there was a TV camera right behind me. And I'd had a knee replacement, so I had a cane, and I was sprawled out on the floor, and they couldn't get us out. They got all the other members out, but they couldn't get about 36 of us that were in the gallery out. And I remember banging on the doors, the insurrectionists who were at the doors, screaming that they were going to hang Mike Pence, that they were going to kill Nancy Pelosi, that they were going to come in and kill us. And I realized in that moment that I had gone there to do my job, to certify the election for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who had been elected by the people of the United States. It's actually my constitutional duty to do that. And never in a million years had I anticipated that I would be in the middle of an insurrection that was fueled by the sitting president of the United States. And in that moment, I realized how incredibly fragile our democracy is. And I think I had been fooled into thinking that it was stable. This is the world's oldest democracy, that it would survive no matter what, that it would just continue. And that, yeah, we needed to do some things and we needed to push for progressive policies. But in that moment, I realized that it is much, much more fragile than that. And that it actually requires every one of us to put our hands on that moral arc of the universe, the arc of the moral universe, and bend it more quickly towards justice. It requires us to vote. It requires us to be engaged. It requires us to actually participate. Otherwise, it's not a democracy, and it will be taken over by people who do vote and who do participate, and by people who lie and cheat and spread misinformation and disinformation and refuse to give up power. The only antidote to that is actually people participating. And so that is why I'm trying to do everything I can, because I think if we don't do that, we are not going to have a path forward for progressive policy. And maybe some of you are frustrated, whether it's around the issue of Gaza or whether it's around the issue of economic change or billionaires. I know I've talked to a lot of people across this country who feel like their vote doesn't matter because the system is controlled by special interests. And I know that there are young people. I was just on a climate mobilization call, climate voters call the other day, young people who feel like the planet's being destroyed. And there's so much mental health trauma. There's just so much grief and trauma across the country. And I think it's a human reaction to want to withdraw from that. But I have been trying to convince people that as an immigrant woman of color organizer, who's also the mom of a beautiful daughter who happens to be trans and being attacked everywhere, I see that our work is not necessarily to find perfection, because perfection is very rarely on the ballot. Very rarely. But real, serious progress that moves us forward, that protects the most vulnerable, that is absolutely on the ballot. It is absolutely on the ballot. And our job as organizers is not to try to find perfection, but actually to try to create the ground that is most fertile for our organizing efforts. The ground where we can actually plant our progressive seeds and water our plants and build our movements rather than being forced to protect people from being deported or imprisoned or made poor or disenfranchised or whatever else is going to happen if one guy gets into office. And so I think that's the work we have to do. And I have always believed we don't suffer in this country from scarcity, we suffer from greed. And that the way to drown out hate and fear is with love and generosity. And so I want to thank you all for doing that work at the school. All of you that as I've read about the school, as I've spoken to Armando, I think what you're doing is so important. And I thank you for being here. And I think if we organize powerfully, we can make what people say is impossible possible. Here's the last thing I would say to you. When people tell me that something I want is impossible, which I've been told a million times, oh, that's impossible. You should be more pragmatic. You should do the things that are possible. I always say back to them, the possible is not static. The possible is not static. What is possible, what is seen as possible, can be moved by us, by organizing, by movements. It is our job to push the boundaries of what is seen as possible and make the impossible possible. Thank you all so much for having me, and I'm happy to have a conversation. With that,
Um,
no, go ahead. You first.
Thanks. Well, thank you, first of all, for being here, for all your work, and for talking about the importance of electing organizers. I work for an environmental nonprofit, Safe Drinking Water Lobbying. And I think one of the things I hear, part-time student at school, but one of the things I hear a lot is how not to jeopardize access to offices. And folks, environmental advocates talking, not necessarily distinguishing between access and influence. And I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about how you see that playing out, and if you have any advice for organizing to see, to work to distinguish between those two things.
Yeah. I mean, I think that they are different, access and influence, and it is a tried and true practice it's a tried and true practice to block influence, but when you or block access, but when you do give access, it's also a tried and true practice to use that to block influence or to detract from influence. And so I think when you are advocating, it's important to, first of all, to remember that we should try to call out the good in people. I mean, we want to call out people, but we also want to call in people. And so if there are ways to say that you think it's a complicated issue, that you know that the person's done some good things, et cetera, those are important. But at the end of the day, you got to be willing to use your access to get influence. And that means that sometimes you have to be willing to oppose. The question of how and when to do that in order to gain influence, I think is complicated. But I know that, for example, with the White House, we did a lot of praising when we got stuff that we wanted. And then we also did a lot of pushing. Now, sometimes that pushing was behind the scenes, because if you push too vocally in front, it can harden the person even more into their position because they feel like they've already been called out. Why do I need to change anything? I've already been called out. This is not always true, but I do think it's all a strategy, and it does depend on what kind of relationship you have. And I do think we need people who are more willing to use the influence piece, which isn't just calling out publicly. It's also building the relationships. It's doing things that are helpful for that person, so that then they want to do things that are helpful for you. I don't know if that's answering your question. Thank you. Yes, right here.
All right. First of all, likewise, wanted to thank you for coming here. But also, it feels increasingly likely that we are on the verge of a second Trump election. And it is hard for, at least from my naive outsider's perspective, not to see that as almost like repudiation of us Democrats specifically, and maybe even like electoralism in general, um, quite specifically of like the rightward shift that Democrats took in rhetoric around immigration, aiding and abetting genocide, et cetera, et cetera. Just wondering, like, what do you and your colleagues think are kind of the lessons we can learn from here, again, about electoralism and the strategy about Democrats in particular?
Okay, first of all, we're going to win. We have to win.
Yeah.
Everything we can to win. I am not ready to see that election yet. However, I think your question is valid regardless, because I do think we have seen the country getting increasingly divided. I do want to point out that even though, because of our outdated electoral college, this goes back to structural reforms, right? The rules. I mean, we have this electoral college system that to me makes no sense whatsoever. It means that I love you guys in Wisconsin and Michigan, other wonderful places I've gone to visit. But why does it always come down to you? The rest of the country care about these issues and are affected. So I want to make sure that we understand that when we say it's very close election, it's close in these electoral college states. We are still the majority in the country. And so I just think that's an important context. That said, I think that for me, there are a lot of lessons about, I wish we had a multi-party system. I mean, I'm a proud Democrat, but would I be if we had multiple parties? I don't know. I mean, I think that, the beauty of a multi-party system is that it's a multi-party system. You can vote on the issues that matter most to you. And then there's a coalition that has to come together. Problems with that, as we're seeing in Europe, nothing's perfect. But in a two-party system, there is this attempt to sort of like move in the conservative direction all the time because the other party is pushing in that direction. So therefore, that's what happens every general election, right? Every primary election, people are a little bit more progressive. Every general election, they move to the center because there are all these voters across the country who are not quite as progressive as primary voters, right? So I think we have to understand that there are things that we need to change in this country, money and politics being a big one, things that are pushing people even further and further to the right, misinformation, disinformation being another one, because when there's no premium placed on truth, how do you fight lies? How do you fight lies? They're all over. Immigrants eating cats and dogs, crazy things that are all part of a strategic plan to dehumanize and disenfranchise. Trump has a book of Hitler speeches right by his bed. And this is all from that same playbook. Make people terrified about their situation today. That leads to them wanting to blame somebody. Once you want to blame somebody, you can dehumanize them. Once you dehumanize them, you do things that you never thought were possible before with that population, right? So I think that what we have to do is have the proposition agenda. We have to speak to working people again. We have to, Democrats lost a lot of working people when we went for free trade agreements, when we didn't raise the minimum wage. There are so many things that we could have done, but we were captured by neoliberal economic thinking. Not everybody, but substantial portion. And so I think what we have to do as progressives is continue to build a case for popular populist ideas. I don't care if we call them progressive. It really does. I mean, I shouldn't say that I'm the chair of the Progressive Caucus. But during Build Back Better, I would say all the time, and the president would call me because he'd hear me on TV. I'd say, it's the president's agenda. I was the chair of the CPC, but I didn't say it was a progressive agenda. I said it's the president's agenda because it's much more effective to have it be the president's agenda, a white, middle-class Scranton Joe seen as a moderate Democrat, than the radical progressive caucus chair, Pramila Jayapal, right? So much better. Let's call it the president's agenda. We have to think about what language we want to use, and we have to continue to appeal to the economic security of people across the country. And that's the work we're trying to do. I don't think it's going to be easy because I do think we're fighting against some structural challenges that make it very difficult to even tell the truth, right? On phone banks, my husband was phone banking and this guy was like, well, you're talking about, the wealthiest paying their fair share, but the wealthiest already pay 40% of the revenue. Now, it's not an accurate thing. But where do you send that person? If you say, go look it up on the internet, he will find things that say that. So it's very challenging, and we need to build a new way of getting information out. We need to improve civics in schools, at the same time that people are fighting to not even teach the history of slavery in this country. So it's challenging. Feels very depressing. But we're going to win in 11 days with your work. But it's going to be challenging.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for being here. I'm a PhD sociology student building, actually, and I study poverty and inequality in rural communities. And so I'm thinking along these lines of strategies for winning back the working class, progressive movement in the future. What about rural communities? What conversations are you in? What strategies are you thinking about?
Well, this antitrust agenda that I'm talking about is huge in rural communities. It's actually bipartisan too. We did a 16-month investigation of the 4 big tech companies. Most of them are headquartered in my district, but I still get elected with 80% of the vote because the people that work for those companies actually want them to be responsible. But what we found is that the antitrust agenda is huge in rural areas, right? Because they've seen small businesses get pushed out by Walmart. They've seen, they don't have drugstores available anymore. Their health centers are closing because they're all being taken over by private equity. And so there are certain things that I think we can go to, particularly for rural communities. I also think that all of the work around regenerative agriculture is really, really fascinating. And John Curtis, who is going to be the next Republican senator from Utah, and I have actually been working on this. We were supposed to go on a trip together to kind of look at how that's working. Maybe that's an area where we can redo the farm bill and we can actually start to help farmers succeed in rural areas using regen techniques. So I think that's another area. But then I also think there's like a core set of economic issues like raising the wage. People said for years that we were a crazy left-wing radical city in Seattle because we raised the wage to 15. And then you saw in state after state, states that went for Donald Trump, like Florida, raise the minimum wage. So these are populist ideas. And I think the more we can push back on the big business lobby that tries to stop some of these things from happening, the more we show and people feel like we're standing up for the little guy. Because I think that is what it stuns me when I hear people saying that Trump is standing up for the little guy, for the working guy. And I'm like, what? But I think we don't fight hard enough, to show that we are, and we don't pass the policies that really show that either. Did you have somebody from the?
I do. So I would, yes, thank you for getting that cue. Okay. So I'll ask, we'll ask 2 questions. I'll ask one from the chat and then I'll call on Barrett, Elward to unmute himself and ask, but, Gus Cochran asks, and this is a strategy question, what do you think Kamala Harris should emphasize in these last 11 days as we head to the election? And then Barrett, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and turn on your video camera if you can in order to ask your question yourself.
I struggle with where to start because I feel like most of this stuff, you say you characterize America as extremely divided, and I would argue that maybe the voting public is divided, but on things, and I'm sure this is frustrating for you as a progressive too, that on most things, most of the country is with you. And so, I think it's something like 80% of Democrats want Medicare for all. And so I have to go back a little bit to, I've been following politics for a while. And so what I've seen since I've been following it is a string of Democratic disappointments and then shifts to the right. So in 2009, Obama had super majorities, 60 votes. They could have killed the filibuster. They could have codified Roe. And none of that stuff happened. These are promises that were made and not delivered upon. And again, in 2020, we see these promises made. I think for many people here, Joe Biden still owes us $600. But my question is mostly for you and the progressive or the squad, the squad as it's informally known. You identify yourself as an organizer, and I'm wondering why the squad did not. It seems like you weren't sufficiently organized in 2021, right? So 2021, Biden won. You had a very narrow, what was it, 50, or with Kamala Harris, you had 51 votes in the Senate, and you had the House. So you had everything. Okay, there's filibuster, there's Joe Manchin, there's Tristan Sinema, but there was an opportunity. The squad held the balance of power, and so there was an opportunity to replace someone like Nancy Pelosi, who I think all of us can agree is extremely corrupt and emblematic of everything that's wrong with corporate capture. And so my question is, why didn't you vote as a bloc to remove Nancy Pelosi? And why did you not exercise power when you had it? And now you don't have the House anymore. Now the Democrats don't have anything. So that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Barrett. Well, I mean, I think if you were listening to what I said, I think that I actually said I think the majority of the country is not divided the way we talk about the election, because it comes down, thanks to the Electoral College, to your states. And like I said, we love you, but we'd like to have a voice too. And so I think I agree with you on that. And I think that I actually share the feeling that it's why I never really wanted to be in elected office, because I felt let down by the Democratic Party, which was the only party that I could really see ever being able to win an election. That's not a multiple party system, it's a two-party system. And so Armando might remember this, I was one of the ones who called Obama deporter in chief. I have fought against my own party many times. And I think that and I agree with you that we should have gotten rid of the filibuster a long time ago when we had super majorities, but we haven't had a super majority since 2009. And I think the sentiment in the country most people didn't even know what the filibuster was. There was no organized effort around that. That's really only happened in the last 10 years, maybe 8 years. But I would just disagree with you that we didn't get stuff done. We got a ton of shit done. We got climate investments. We got Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices. All the things I went through. Did we get everything? No, we didn't, because we still had the filibuster. And we have this bizarre rule. You have to do everything by budget reconciliation, which is why minimum wage got cut out. And some unelected woman named the parliamentarian, poor thing. I mean, she's just trying to do her job, but she makes the decision about whether or not something falls within the budget reconciliation rules. And so it's why I focus so much on structural change, because I think that there have been rules put in place that allow for, the corporatists, the extreme right, to stop us from making progress. And most people across the country don't understand that that's what's happening. If you go out and talk to voters, I mean, I'm doing a lot of education around the filibuster. And now I find people raising their hand when I say, who knows what the filibuster is? If I were to actually call on somebody to explain it, maybe you would be able to in this room. But in many of the rooms I'm in, people wouldn't, right? They know there's something there, but they're not really sure. And so if you try to explain to someone, well, we couldn't get that done because of the filibuster, because there was this parliamentarian, they don't care. They just want the minimum wage to go up. Like, why isn't the minimum wage going up? So I do think we have to be much more strategic about how we're going to get stuff done, because it is impossible now to get 60 votes for anything. And I think a lot of people have been in office for like 30 years when maybe Republicans and Democrats did work together and the Republican Party was much more reasonable. That's not the case today. So if we want some of these big things to pass, they're not going to pass in a bipartisan way. And it's taken a while to get our members of Congress who've been around for a long time to come to that conclusion. But I think that to undermine what we got done is also a mistake, because it really takes away the power of the people that came together to make those things happen. And I think that is unfortunate, because to say that we, to say that we didn't get as much as we wanted, all those critiques are fine. I'm happy, as you've heard, I'm happy to critique my own party. I'm happy to critique myself. But we also have to recognize that when we get things done, let's actually talk about how we got them done, why we got them done, and celebrate them, because people need victories also, and they are real victories. Don't tell me that it's not a victory that we got Medicare to negotiate drug prices, or that we finally raised taxes on the wealthiest, or that we finally got the biggest investment ever in climate change. Those are not empirical, mythic victories. Those are real victories that the people made happen. And I think we should lean into that as much as we lean into critiques, which I think are important and valuable to getting us to do our work better. Oh, and the first question about Kamala Harris. So I actually just passed this message along a couple times in the last week. I would really like, I know that there are some important reasons to talk about what John Kelly said about, Trump being a fascist and all of that. But I really think we need a strong economic message. I want her to talk about how people's lives are going to be different when she is president. When I go to places and I talk about the fact that she's including a long-term care benefit in Medicare, that's one of her proposals. The rooms, it doesn't matter where I am, the rooms erupt when I talk about investing in housing and giving people a down payment, the poorest folks a down payment so they can buy their first house. Huge applause. I want her to talk about universal childcare. I want her to talk more about raising the wage, because it's also about lifting up wages for people so that they can start to afford things. I want her to talk more about price gouging. She has been talking some about it, but I want her to talk more about that. I want the economic argument, and I would like her to talk about how she's going to be different on the Middle East policy, but I'm not sure I'm going to get that.
First of all, thanks so much for a fantastic talk. This has been really interesting. And I think you make a really compelling case for not only the possibilities of progressive change at a domestic level, but also of the progressive bona fides of the current administration. I think where it's much harder to do that is in what we just talked about last, which is about in relation to foreign policy. And one of the things that you talked about in your talk was the importance of recognizing the barriers and obstacles to progressive change. What I think is interesting is that in relation to domestic policy, I think you can rightly point to the Republican Party and potentially business interests as the main obstacles to domestic change. But in relation to foreign policy, it seems like the greatest barrier to progressive policy is the Democratic Party in general, and the president at the moment in particular in relation to the Middle East. We had Omer Bartov speak here 2 weeks ago, who is an Israeli academic, and he's a professor of genocide studies at Brown University. And he made the case that what the Israeli state is perpetrating right now are war crimes and acts of genocide. And not only that, but it is doing this on the basis of a unique relationship between the United States, between the state of the United States and the Israeli government. Israel is not only the largest recipient of military aid in the world, but also the largest recipient of civilian aid and the only one able to spend that on further weapons. It's also the only country in the world allowed to bypass the State Department and negotiate directly with American arms manufacturers. And so what I'm interested in is, as someone who has spoken out, called for a ceasefire, spoken for an end to arming Israel, I'm interested in how do you think that you others can create a more fertile soil, as you put it earlier, for beginning to make changes in this area? And how much dissent do you think there is within the Democratic Party? And finally, I was at the Obama Tim Walz rally a couple of days ago. It was in many respects really inspiring, but I couldn't help but notice the lack of discussions of foreign policy, which almost feels like it is ceding that the Republican Party in this election.
Yeah. Look, I think if we lose Michigan, it's probably because of the war, and I think it's devastating to me on a human level, on a political level. I have been as vocal as I can be, and also privately. I've had long conversations with the president directly, with the vice president directly. And I think that it's why I always say Joe Biden has been our most progressive president on domestic economic policy. I'm very clear when I say that, because on foreign policy, this is a man, and I'm close to the president, but this is a man who has a worldview of Israel and of U.S.-Israeli relationships that dates back to half a century ago. And there has been this, this belief that somehow we're going to cause Israel to do less harm by engaging, by continuing to provide weapons. And from my perspective, your perspective, so many people's perspective, this is, Jewish people across the country largely agree with this as well. This is our leverage. And by the way, we have Leahy laws, domestic laws, that actually could institute right now to withhold shipments of offensive military weapons to Israel. That would be enforcing our domestic laws. And we're not doing that. And some of that is the president himself and his views on this. And he is still the president. And she is the vice president. So even though she has, I think she's more aligned in some ways, she can't really completely disown it because she's part of that administration. At the same time, I think there are very strong interests. And in Congress, it is both encouraging and discouraging. 8 years ago, we would never have been able to get more than a handful of votes for holding any military assistance to Israel. We were able to get over 60 votes for that several months ago when we were whipping those votes, but we couldn't get more than that. So we do have, there's deep entrenched interests. It's not just AIPAC and that lobby. There's also CUFI, which is the Christians United for Israel, which is an evangelical, right-wing evangelical, very wealthy network of people that are pushing for that kind of policy. And then you've got Trump, who would be very happy. Netanyahu would be very happy if Trump were president. So I think it's a big mess. And I don't have a good answer. I have a 27-year-old who, I think like so many people across this country is watching the videos, and it's just brutal. It's heartbreaking. And my Jewish friends, not even necessarily progressives, they see that there's no answer here unless there's actually security for Palestinians, and so they don't see this. We haven't. The only time we got hostages back was when we had a ceasefire for a very, very short period of time. I think a lot of it has to do with the president himself, but I also think there are all these other structural pieces. And on foreign policy, it's complicated. He got us out of Afghanistan, which we all wanted. Have happened the way we wanted it, but he got us out of Afghanistan. He felt very strongly about that. He was very proud of not having any wars. And now we're in the middle of a major one, the Middle East. We've got Ukraine and Russia. There's a lot of issues, and we've got fascists and dictators on the rise around the world. So the United States position is even more important. So I think on foreign policy, we have a lot of work to do. And as progressives, we need to have a better notion of what progressive foreign policy looks like. It does. Because we're also losing the battle on Pentagon funding. We get fewer and fewer votes, or maybe just about the same votes, to cut Pentagon spending, when the Pentagon is the only federal agency that has never passed an audit, like multiple times has failed audits, not just passed, has failed audits. And yet we continue to increase Pentagon spending. And now Democrats are caught in this cycle because you'll hear about parity when we get to passing appropriations bills. Parity is a concept that however much you increase defense spending by, you increase non-defense discretionary spending by. So instead of talking about cutting defense spending, which 20 years ago, we actually had defense spending was lower than non-defense discretionary, which is education, healthcare, all the other stuff, right? But now we're tied to this idea of parity is the best we can get. So we're like, okay, well, if you have to increase defense spending by 5%, make sure you increase non-defense discretionary spending by 5%. I hate that. I hate it when we talk about parity, because we've given up on the idea that why should there be parity? Why can't we have defense spending significantly less, invest in diplomacy, invest in development, limit spend on military, because most of it is going to the same defense contractors. There's like 3 of them that get most of the money. So all of that is part of the foreign policy equation. I think on Gaza, I wish I had a better idea for you. I mean, a better answer for you. I'm very frustrated by where we are. And I think it's a combination of multiple factors, but I think there's no question that if Trump is in office, let's not forget that it was Trump who enabled and empowered Netanyahu to expand settlements in the West Bank. It was Trump who moved the embassy to Jerusalem. It was Trump who appointed David Friedman, who Steve and I met with when we went to Israel. That guy has monetary interests. He invests in the settlers, in the settler movement. So we just have to remember that he is going to empower Netanyahu to do everything. And we have to keep hope that once Pramila is president, that we can continue to impress upon her our moral, our constitutional, our legal obligations to enforce domestic law and to bring peace in the Middle East.